It's Backseas Musical Podcast.
Resistance is useless!
For as far back as anyone can remember, major recording companies were always desperate to find the next big thing. When the Beatles became the biggest thing in the world, record companies swarmed in and grabbed every British rock band they can get their hands on. Same thing happened with Led Zeppelin. One day, everyone thinks that Jimmy Page's new band was a dumb idea. The next thing you know, every guitar riff-driven rock band gets signed to a record deal. The same could be said of Guns N' Roses or Motley Crue or Nirvana. Once record companies could figure out that a new scene was emerging, they signed everyone they could. The problem was that not every band wanted to sign with a major label. Some wanted to maintain their integrity to avoid being bought and sold like a commodity. For some, the idea of selling out was less appealing than playing for nothing at all. And the idea of not selling out was not only important to the artist, it was also important to the hometown fan who took it as an insult whenever their favorite local band grew beyond that local audience. Today's guest is music writer Dan Ozzie. Dan has just released a brand new book called Sellout, the major label feeding frenzy that swept punk, emo, and hardcore from 1994 to 2007. It's a fascinating book that takes a look at 11 different bands that includes Green Day, Blink-182, My Chemical Romance, Jawbreaker, and several others. It's not only about the bands, but it's also about the unspoken cost of success, near success, and failure. This is my conversation with author Dan Ozzie on Backseas Musical Podcast. I've been ripping through the book as hard as I can, about 75% done. It's
a brick. I appreciate you.
No. I mean, you're right. It is kind of like it's kind of like furniture. But I found the book fascinating. Like I was as thick as it is. I was not able to put it down. And I think the thing that I find so interesting about it, and I've read a lot of books that talk about bands and the track of their career, but I think what's so interesting about this particular treatment of this is that there's this constant feeling about the idea of fulfilling or not fulfilling expectations, and whether that expectation be of the artist or the fans or the press or the record company. It's like no matter how successful you hope to be, each level of that success comes with a pretty substantial cost.
Yeah, for sure. And I mean, like, expectations are really hard to manage, especially when you're a young person, because I feel like going into it, the most level-headed people, their objective is to make the best album that they can. And even when they do that and they feel like they succeed, then you still have these people above you being like, yeah, but you didn't sell enough copies, you didn't get on the radio or whatever. And it is hard to manage those expectations when, like, you're managing so many people's expectations.
Well, it's funny you say that. I mean, there are countless of examples of bands that would release a record that sells 20 million copies, and the next record sells 15 million copies. That would be a success by anyone else's interpretation, but because it didn't sell as much, it's considered a failure. And oftentimes, these record companies would just give up on promoting that record or give up on promoting that band. And when you put it into that kind of perspective, it's almost like, what kind of business model does that?
Yeah. I mean, it often gets overlooked in hindsight, but that happened to Green Day where, like Dookie, I think in its first year, just in the United States, sold 3 million copies. And then just a year later, they put out their follow-up Insomniac, and within a few months, I think it had sold like a few 100,000 records, but it was like struggling. And, by punk standards, I mean, like if Doogie hadn't happened and they had sold a few 100,000 records, they would have been like the biggest band in punk that ever did that.
Right.
But yeah, because they had to do this follow up, it created this like absurdly high bar that they had to match,
It's interesting to me that you picked Green Day as like a dive-in point on this book, because the truth is, I mean, you could have easily started things off with Nirvana or Guns N' Roses, or even gone back to the British invasion for all that matters, because the reaction of record companies has always been relatively consistent in that regard. It's like, it's, what have you done for me lately? Even though this outrageous success is great, it's not enough. It's like you're always trying to replicate something that's impossible to duplicate.
For sure. I remember talking to a guy who was an A&R guy at Capitol Records, and he was like, by the time I got there, Capitol Records was struggling. Like, we needed a hit. And I was like, but didn't you just sell like 100 million albums with MC Hammer? And he was like, yeah, but that was the year before. So I was like, oh, wow, it moves that fast, huh?
What is it about Green Day specifically that was so different at that moment? Because, I mean, you're right. By punk standards, Dookie's sold an extraordinarily mind-blowing number of copies. No one had ever really done that in punk music. And then, but in your estimation, what was it about them that separated them from everybody else?
They're really a special band. I think time has proven that. But they were just like, I don't know, there's a certain, this sounds very cheesy, but there's a certain element of like magic, just right place, right time, right songs where, like they came out of a scene that was very fertile with like Operation Ivy and Sam I Am and these like Berkeley bands. But Green Day came along and they just at the perfect time where there was groundwork laid, and they wrote these songs that were fast and aggressive, but at the same time, like radio friendly, like they were melodic, and
right.
Billy is very cute, and they just like, it's just one of those things where like all of the stars aligned at once. And then really like, I put this in the book, but that Woodstock performance was just like millions of people just got a glimpse into this young band that was just like, ready. It was just like the world was ready for them. And then like after that, they just exploded. So it's really hard to quantify that kind of stuff, but it was just there's like an X factor to it, that you can't even put your finger on, just like capturing the cultural zeitgeist. And especially too, after Nirvana, like after Kurt had passed, Green Day was like, yeah, we'll step in.
And what's fascinating in the book is, in spite of the success, you have all these local fans that follow this band from the very, very beginning. It's a rabid, passionate fan base that follows them early on. But as soon as they start to have the success that every band secretly wants to have, all of a sudden you have this backlash as if, well, Green Day is sold out. And not just the fans, even in the book you talk about their home club that they were playing at constantly had this policy of not allowing any band signed to a major label to play there, as if they somehow compromised their integrity by becoming a success in a way that was probably a good deal out of their control.
Yeah, and I don't know what it's like to be in that position specifically, but it just feels like human nature that it's hurtful. Like if you have 100 people and 99 of them tell you that you're the greatest thing ever, and then one person has a snarky comment to make, of course you're going to remember that one. It's just, and it's just sort of like human nature. I mean, Green Day in that one year, they played at Madison Square Garden. They played at Woodstock. They won a Grammy. They sold 3 million copies just in the U.S. Like it was the highest heights you could have reached. And then they were just still dragged down by, these haters, basically.
And that's always been kind of true about punk fans in particular. There's always this backlash against those that sell out. But at the same time, you talk to guys from like, Black Flag or the Circle Jerks about how these crowds or the crowds were changing over time. It was, first you got hardcore fans, and then all of a sudden there's this, wave of violence and skinheads and, guys, beating the crap out of each other and, acting like thugs at these shows. And then you have, bands trying to do what they can to stop all this. And it's like, again, you're accusing a band of selling out, but yet you're the ones ruining it for everybody else. I mean, it's a kind of a weird double standard that occurred in punk in the 80s and heading into the 90s.
Yeah, I mean that's sort of like one of the central reasons that I mentioned in the at the drive-in chapter for their sort of demise, which is like, they were getting bigger and bigger and bigger, like literally by the week they were just becoming bigger, and but they had people coming to their shows to like hurt people, like they had seen Slam Dancing on MTV or whatever, and they came and they were being aggressive, and the band was very uncomfortable with it, and it became this weird push and pull of like, how do we get on a bigger level but still kind of protect our audience, and
Right.
and it just, the answer was it didn't work.
I thought that chapter was really fascinating because and part of it is because you also in a previous chapter mentioned Ian MacKaye of Fugazi, and there's a guy who casts a pretty big shadow in throughout the punk world. I mean, this is a guy who has unparalleled integrity as far as his music and his own Discord records, and if he ever sees violence in the crowd, he stops playing. And it's interesting how in that chapter of at the drive-in, they were trying to emulate that same exact stance, and how it wound up burning them in the end, because by trying to protect the fans that cared about them the most, they ostracized, they alienated themselves from that crowd, and they never had the ability to recover. And again, expectations. This is a band that was considered to be about to be the biggest thing in the world, and it didn't happen.
Yeah, and I mean, like, they cite Ian as a big influence for how they commanded their stages when they went to places. But this is certainly no disrespect to Ian, somebody I look up to greatly, and Fugazi. But like, at the drive-in was primed to play bigger places than Fugazi ever played. Fugazi played these really big halls for people who mostly got it, but at the drive-in was doing these festivals where they'd be next to Mudvayne or Limp Bizkit, and the crowd that was there, they didn't sometimes a lot of times even know who at the drive-in was. They would just come in for the weekend to dance around and whatever and have fun. And so like, I think at the drive-in maybe found the cap. They found the limit of like how far you can bring that mentality of like stage policing.
There's also a big part of the book that talks about the transition that a lot of these independent record companies have to make, apart from Ian MacKaye, because I think he is the exception, not the rule, when it comes to this kind of thing. He's been very specific and very deliberate over his career, but a lot of bands start off with these independent labels, and as soon as these records start to sell, and all of a sudden these bands become more famous and the notoriety gets bigger and the venues become bigger, what happens is that these independent labels can no longer support the growth of this band. It's almost as if the worst thing that can happen to an independent label is for someone to be successful. It's
right.
I mean, it happened. I mean, I was thinking a while back about Metallica. There's a good example of a band that started on a real ma and pa type of label. All of a sudden, they become the biggest thing in metal, and there's nothing that this little label can do for them. They had almost no choice but to go for a major label, because a major label could give them what they needed and maybe deserved. But it's a remarkably bizarre dynamic between the independent and the majors.
What I was just talking about too, like at the drive-in, finding that like growth cap. I think some of the labels in this book found it too, where it's just like, oh, we can support a band up until this point, and then after that, we actually don't have the capacity to do it, and sometimes we're even like holding them back. And I think the smart labels were the ones that like did not begrudge their artists for going somewhere else. You know what I mean? Because it was like, we would be hindering you if we tried to keep you at this point. You know,
a lot of the major labels, especially in the 80s, because they were looking at college radio, and they were looking at the sales of some of these bands, were signing bands like Husker Du and Sonic Youth and REM as like heritage type of signings. not really expecting these guys to go out and sell a million copies of their records, but it was like it almost, because we signed Husker Du, that may entice us to find someone who is really impressed with that news, and
Totally.
they'll make us money.
I mentioned that in the intro, that you could basically count on one hand the bands on the 80s that went to majors, right? Husker Du, Replacements, Sonic Youth. And I always wonder what the motivation was behind that. Like, was it a prestige signing? Was it like some guy at the label being like trying to get cred? Or maybe like if they thought that they signed Husker Du, that would help them sign somebody they really wanted, like, I don't know what it was. Or maybe they just wanted the critical acclaim, like the band would get a good review in the Village Voice and then they could put a feather in their cap. But yeah, I don't think that like when they signed a band like Husker Du, they were like, yes, this will sell 1 million copies. Or maybe they did. I don't know. But it just seems like throughout the 80s, those were so much rarer. And I wonder what the mentality behind that was.
So I come at this from a radio angle, because I've been in radio for 30 plus years, and what I remember back in the 80s is that record reps would visit radio stations. They try to convince programmers to add records, and sometimes those records were appropriate to play, and other times they were not that good, or they just didn't fit the format, or whatever it would be. But you do mention something about this, about record executives, how there is a lack of connectivity between them and the artists that they are trying to sell. And how I can try to visualize that is I remember very specifically when we were at the radio station, we're playing hair bands, primarily. That was the big thing we were playing back in the 80s. And so you'd have record companies, your record reps show up at the radio station, wearing, Dayglow spandex with 8 balls of coke in their jacket. And the next minute, these very same guys, the same individuals, are showing up at the radio station wearing flannel shirts and knit caps and smoking clove cigarettes. It's the same guys who I don't think they truly understand what they're doing. All they know is that they have to do it that way. And a signing...
That's so funny.
Well, it was one of those things that was always, I thought, always comical, because, here they are with these legacy signings. They don't know anything about these guys other than to say, isn't it cool that I have these guys? Because when that happens, all of a sudden you get like a Blink 182 or a Jawbreaker who, shows great potential, and maybe you can do something with that. And if you're lucky enough to get, Green Day signed or something like that, or as big as that, then all of a sudden you're considered to be a genius, which is, I think is always been true of record companies.
I mean, I'm trying to have like a little bit of empathy, and I guess I will just say this in those guys' defense. I realize this is like a weird hill to die on, but like if I'm going to find empathy for those guys, I think it is a weird thing where, when you're going to a big label, your A&R is the person who signs you, and they really get what you're doing, and they're looking out for you. But then like once you get into this company, then you have like radio guys, promotion people, marketing people, whoever, who like work there. They didn't pick the band to be signed, but now, they've been dumped Blink 182 on their laps or whatever it is. And they all of a sudden have to market it. And you have to be a bit of a chameleon, I guess, like I'm just trying to like look for the shades of subtlety in the, if they're being disingenuous, be like, it is a weird job for those guys to have, that you're just like, okay, here's your roster this year. Go sell these records, The time frame of the book is 1994 to 2007, and it's a very interesting time frame in music, because as you get into the 2000s, the role of the record company changes dramatically. And especially as, when you're talking about downloads and streaming, content, record companies, in for better or for worse, are do not have the same juice that they used to. You don't hear of someone signing a Green Day anymore, because in the way of trying not to sell out, a lot of artists can do it all on their own, and do. It actually takes a lot of that ethos of the
the DIY and applies it to today. How do you see the role of record companies today as opposed to 94 to 2007?
Well, I think a lot of young bands like look at record labels and be like, and with a more skeptical eye, like, well, what do I need you for? You know, I mean, I think that's been around for a while, but I do think that the role of A&R has changed where I think that, you know, decades ago, a band would get signed by an A&R person and it was sort of the standard that, you know, they were going to like work on this band for a couple years to try to like make them big. And I think now it's a little bit more geared towards like, what can we buy that seems to already be popular? Because there's stuff that you can just quantify now. You can see how many like TikTok followers somebody has, how many like Instagram followers they have, whatever it is. You can like crunch the numbers and be like, we can make this much money off of this. But I don't know if are they as invested in like growth over the long term? You know, like everything now moves so quickly that I don't know that record labels are as invested in like investing in artists for the long term.
And where do you think that leaves the artist? I mean, because obviously, someone who is successful, someone who can get the appropriate number of streams or hits can maybe monetize what they do, but it also requires a hell of a lot of work. And for some of these guys, there's you're like in suspended animation. You're trying to meter out what you release, and even though your return the percentage of return may be greater by the dollar, the amount of time that it takes to do it all yourself is almost makes it sound like being a rock star kind of sucks.
Yeah, I have. I have this friend Tim Barry. He used to sing for the band of Veil, and one time he told me when people ask what he does, he doesn't say he's a musician. He says he does retail music management because you have to know how to like sell merch orders and fix the van, and you set up your website and run your promos on your Instagram and all this stuff. So yeah, like it does take a hell of a lot more work. The benefit is that you do reap 100% of the reward. But I think like it's kind of like what we were talking about earlier with there being like a growth potential cap. Like you can own a lot of your own success now without the help of any record labels, right? If you are really good at marketing yourself on social media and everything. But there are still apparati that big record labels control that a person really can't crack into. The radio is one. International distribution is sometimes another one. So there are still like powers that major labels have. But I don't know. I know that all of my artist friends do so much hands-on work right now. And yeah, I don't know if that'll ever change or if that's just the way it is now.
The downside of that, ultimately winds up being, can a band sustain itself financially to do all those things, to tour, to create merch, to sell it, to have the entire infrastructure exist? I mean, in a way, every artist is now their own record company. And to me, that may be the only way that saves music, is for artists to literally take control of the whole damn thing, because what other incentive would there be to even make music if it means you're broke and destitute with very few opportunities to move ahead? I mean, does that make sense? Do you see what I'm getting at?
I do. And in a way, like it's become, like everything's become like more punk, right? Like more DIY.
Right.
People do get to own like everything they do. At the same time, like they are beholden to the mercy of like big companies like Spotify and, YouTube and stuff that like holds all the, like there are sort of like gatekeepers in that world. I like the tech world. But yeah, like the potential for ownership is definitely much greater than it's ever been, I think.
And I think you're right about the how important punk that standard is, because without punk ever existing. I'm not sure that people. I mean, I think eventually they probably would have come around to the idea of this DIY perspective, but it would have taken maybe a few more years before that happened. And clearly that's the way it is. I mean, I've talked to a bunch of people who are making music by themselves. They're file sharing with other musicians. They're not with the pandemic and everything. Certainly, it knocks the progression forward over a notch because you have to now adjust everything for time and not being able to necessarily see the people that you're playing with. It's a bizarre time for music, but it is very interesting to me how things are coming around full circle with the basic idea of punk that I don't need to be Rick Wakeman. I don't need to be Eddie Van Halen. I can do this on my own and not sell out and not compromise my own standards and expectations of my art.
For sure. I mean, like that's kind of what I tried to hint at the epilogue of the book, of just sort of like we're kind of back where we started, like you said, full circle.
Again, I really did enjoy the book. I'm anxious to read the last 25% of it. I will finish it. It's a fascinating look at how music has changed and where it went during that period. Again, Sellout, the major label feeding frenzy that swept punk, emo, and hardcore. Dan, Ozzie, it's great to talk to you. Appreciate the time.
Oh, thank you so much.
Again, the name of the book is Sellout, the major label feeding frenzy that swept punk, emo, and hardcore by Dan Ozzie. Thanks for listening. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, I'd love to hear from you. You can email me at bax@rock102.com. And we'll see you next time on Baxi's Musical Podcast.